Hilchos, Issurei, Mizbeach, Perek Shvi. The laws of entities forbidden to be offered on the altar, chapter 7. Today's the final chapter, we're finishing these laws. And really, this chapter is about raising standards. In the last couple of days, we've learned all the things that are forbidden or disqualified for use on the Mizbeach. An animal with a defect, flour, wine, and oil not of the highest quality, different woods, etc. And a person who operates on the lowest level would say, okay, as soon as I'm out of the forbidden zone, I'll bring what's not forbidden. But I won't care the level or the quality to which that product or item is going to be that I'm going to bring. And the Rambam wants to raise us to a higher level. You're dealing with a sacrifice, you're dealing with holiness, you're dealing with Hashem. You don't want to just be out of the red zone. You want to be deep in the green zone. And therefore the Rambam's opening line of today's chapter, Halacha Aleph, is Loi kol davar she'enei pasol mevi oisei lechatchila. Not everything which is not disqualified should you be bringing as an initial preference. Just because it's not forbidden doesn't mean that's what you should be bringing. Keitzad, what would that mean? A person did something, entered a situation where he's obligated to bring a burnt offering. Lo yavi se kachush v'kor. Don't bring an emaciated, ugly sheep. V'yomer and say, harei ein boimum. There's no blemish. I checked all the boxes. It's totally okay from a halachic standpoint. It's cheap. V'alzen nemar, about such a person it says in Malachi, v'arur noichel v'gomer. Cursed is the trickster. Hashem is talking to people. If you look at the end of the verse, it says, cursed is the trickster, v'yesh be'edrei zachar. In his flock he has a choice male animal. V'noider v'zoveach mashchas la'Hashem. And instead he promises and he brings the destroyed, the inferior quality stuff to Hashem. If you could bring a higher level, don't be bringing a lower level just because it's allowed. Whatever you bring for sacrifices, bring from the choicest. As a matter of fact, says the Rambam, in times of old, they didn't just talk the talk, they walked the walk. This is how the Jews used to behave in the time of the temple. For any specific item or animal, you would look for where was the best place to get it in Israel. And even sometimes imported from outside of Israel. Says the Rambam, rams. That's sheep. Same sheep as in the Torah is the first year of life. Ram is the second year of life. They would bring rams from Moav, outside of Israel, a neighboring land. That's where the best rams were raised. And all the Jews, when they had to bring a sacrifice as a ram, you brought from there. And they would bring sheep that had wide backs, juicy sheep from Chevron. I made a map here. It's a bit approximate, but of course Chevron is a little bit to the south of Jerusalem, and we'll just say that it's around here. Sheep came from Chevron. Calves, they would bring from the Sharon area, up top towards Haifa. It's not really one specific city, it's more like a swath of land. Today it's called Chevel HaSharon. And they would bring calves from there. That's where the best calves were. And they would bring birds from what's called the mountain of the king. Har HaMelech, it's a little bit hard to identify exactly where this is. Some have posited that it's where today's Arab village in Judea and Samaria, there's an Arab village that's called Kfar Malich, or Malik. Sounds like Melech. They say that's where the mountain of Har HaMelech was. It's somewhere in Ephraim's portion. And at any rate, the best birds would come from there. We're now in the 9 days of mourning leading up to Tisha B'Av, and the temple was destroyed. On Tisha B'Av, you're not supposed to learn many parts of Torah, because Torah makes one happy, and we're not supposed to be happy on this day. But there are some sugyos, there are some Talmudic discussions which we're allowed to learn, the ones that recount the events relating to the Churban. And one of them is related to Har HaMelech, this mountain. It says in the Talmud, over the incident of a rooster and a hen, Tur Malka, which is Har HaMelech, was destroyed. Jewish people used to have a custom when a bride and groom would go to the chuppah, they would have a rooster and a hen walk in front of them as a symbol of Pru as being fruitful and multiply. Same way chickens lay many eggs, this couple should have many children. And at one time, one such wedding, there was a group of Roman soldiers that went by, they saw 2 chickens, they grabbed the chickens, and the Jews who were so offended by the violation of their custom, they pounced on the soldiers and wounded them. And these soldiers sent a message to Rome that the Jewish people rebelled. And it was the beginning of a destruction. They came and they destroyed this whole area. But during temple times, it was a very prominent area, Har HaMelech. They used to bring the birds from Har HaMelech. And they would bring wine from 2 places called Korchayin and Halutayin. That's one version. Some of your Rambams might have a little bit different versions of the text. Even in the Talmud, there's different versions. We don't know where these places are because of these different versions of wording. Even the early commentators already note, we don't know which exact geographical locations the wine used to come from. The soiles, mi michmash v'yoichana. They would bring flour from a place called Michmash and Yoichana. Michmash, today they also have a place called Ma'ale Michmash. It's a newer settlement in Judea and Samaria. It's somewhere just under Har HaMelech, also in the north over here, towards the north. Yoichana is somewhere near there. I couldn't find the exact location on the map, so I just didn't put it on. Umevi'in shemen mi Tekoa. And they would bring oil from Tekoa. The Mishnah says, Tekoa alfa la shemen. Tekoa was Aleph, grade A plus for oil. Of course, the Hanukkah story incorporates Tekoa. Tekoa is a little bit north of Jerusalem, and that's the story where the Jews only found pure oil enough to last for one day, and it would take 8 days to get the new oil. So they would have to travel to Tekoa, where they brought the oil, processed it, and it would take 8 days to get back and forth. And the miracle was that the single jug of pure oil lasted for 8 days. That's Tekoa. Point is, the Rambam is saying, the Jews, even in the temple times, would always look to bring the best of the best. And if you knew something grew or was farmed in a certain area, and that was the highest grade, you got from there. Same thing with wood, says the Rambam. Halacha Gimel, Kol ha'etzim ha'chadashim k'shedim la'maracha. We said yesterday that as long as it's new wood, it's kosher for the wood pile. This is the wood pile on the Mizbeach. Every day they made a wood pile. So yesterday the Rambam said if you demolish a house, you can't take the wood from the house and put it on the Mizbeach. But if it's new wood, it's kosher. Nevertheless, they looked for the best. The Jews did not bring olive wood or wood from grape vines, even though actually those were of superior quality, because, and if you're using the Muznayim Rambam that I use now, you're actually missing a full line in the Hebrew. I'm going to read it from, just have it here on my phone because I saw that it was missing. The missing words are, mishum yishuv eretz Yisrael, because of concern for the settlement of the land of Israel. Wine and oil are necessities, and if you would be chopping down all the trees to get wood for the Mizbeach, you wouldn't leave the wine and the vines and the oil trees and the olive trees. So they didn't cut those down. They didn't use those for the Mizbeach. Some also allude to what the Gemara says about these trees, that they used to have some knots in the wood which could cause extra smoke, which also wasn't good. So they wouldn't use those. Instead, ube'elu hayudegilin. In the following trees they were accustomed to using. B'murbiyos shel te'ena, shel chadashim, or some Rambams have shel charashim, probably the more accurate text. Branches from fig trees of charashim, of forests. She'enan bayishuv, not the ones that are in the settled areas. And now we're back, if you have the Muznayim Rambam, we're back to the printed text. Uveshel egos, uveshel eitz shemen. They also used to use walnut wood and eitz shemen. Eitz shemen means oily tree, which sounds like a redundancy of olive trees, but Rashi actually explains eitz shemen means trees that have wood that burn fast. If they burnt well, they caught fire well, that was what they looked for the Mizbeach. Now, the wood, of course, was chopped into logs and into pieces. It says that Rambam Hagzarin Sha'asa Moshe, way back in the desert, when the Mishkan, the first home for Hashem, was in use, Moshe Rabbeinu used to fashion wooden logs for the Mizbeach. The logs that he fashioned were Amma Orkon ve'Amma Rachman. They were square in length and width, 1 amma long, 1 amma wide. The Avyan, and their thickness was Kemachak Godish Shel Se'ah. Machak is like a tool that you use for leveling. When you make a pile of grain, you want to level it at the top. So if you have a stack of grain, a se'ah worth, it's a measure of volume, the leveling tool that was used for that, that's how thick the logs were. And you can see actually here in the picture, the main wood pile was more longer logs, proper logs, but every day accompanying the sacrifice, they would actually bring 2 of these square logs like Moshe Rabbeinu did, like the ones that Moshe made, they made for all generations. You can see him. So he's carrying a square piece of wood, which is a little bit thick like a leveling tool. Halacha Dalid says that Rambam, it wasn't even the final product that was always looked to be superior quality. Even in preparation of the products, they used to always go superior. How did they act when it came to planting the wheat that was going to be used for flour offerings and for accompanying other sacrifices? They didn't just look for good flour. They went all the way back. When planting, they were doing the highest quality of planting. The way they would do it was as follows. They would plow half the field, but leave it unplanted, and only plant the other half of the field. So that only half was growing at a time. The next year, you plow, but you leave fallow the half that was planted last year. V'zara hachetzi ha'acher, and you plant the other half that was left fallow from the year before. Kaidam la Pesach shivim yom, 70 days before Pesach. That was the optimum time for planting. If the field was not tilled yet, it wasn't worked, you would plow twice and only then plant. Again, alter produce the best final product. After the wheat grew, you sorted the wheat kernels very well. And afterwards, you would beat the wheat and step on them a lot, till the shells were completely peeled off of the kernels. Shifa and be'ita, 2 steps in preparing, beating the wheat and trotting upon them. It says that Rambam didn't just do it once or twice, this beating and trotting. Kol achitim shel menachos, any wheat that was going to be used for flour offerings, to unais shleish meyos shifa v'chamesh meyos be'ita, needed to be beaten 300 times and trotted upon 500 times. And the way you would do this, you wouldn't just do 300 beats in a row and then 500 trots. You did it in a pattern. Shaf achas ubayet shtayim, shaf shtayim ubayet shalish. 1 beating, 2 trottings, 2 beatings, 3 trottings. So that every 8 steps, nimtzu shalish shifais v'chamesh be'itais. You have a ratio of 3 to 5. 3 beats and 5 trods. V'chayzer chalila, you keep doing this. 1, 2, 2, 3. Ad sheyigmar shleish me'ez shifa v'chamesh me'ez be'ita, till you finished 300, 500. Kadesh yiskalf harbe, all with the goal of making the shells very, very much peeled from the kernels, and you were left with just the purest kernel of wheat. So much so, says the Rambam, striking or beating would go in a forward motion and a backward motion. The forward motion and backward motion were considered to be 1 beating to be stringent. So it wasn't like 300 times 1, 2. 1, 2 was considered 1 out of the 300. All again to make it more and more and more fine. And of course, after you finished striking and beating and trotting, you would grind the kernels, and sift it very well. And then you ended up with the final best flour for flour offerings. So that's the story on how they got the best flour for the Beis HaMikdash's use. Now halacha vav hayayin, same thing for the wine. Only looked for the most superior, and it was prepared in the most meticulous way. First of all, mevi anavim min hareglios. You only bring grapes from the foot vines. What is a foot vine? Typically, today and even back then, vines are not allowed to grow naturally. You train them onto a trellis or onto a pole so they grow upwards and you can produce the most and use the most space. But naturally, if you just let a vine grow, it'll actually trail on the ground. That's the grape in its most default state. And that's the type of grape that they used to look for when dealing with the Beis HaMikdash. You only used grapes from the vines that grew by the foot. In other words, on the floor, naturally. Min akramim ha'avudim pa'amayim b'shana. They would look for vineyards that were tilled twice a year. V'doirech, and then you would press the grapes, as they always did. The pressed grapes, or the wine that came from them, would be stored not in huge vats or barrels, small jugs, small barrels. They would be stored not 1 by 1, not 2 by 2, but in groups of 3. You also wouldn't fill up the barrel as you usually did, all the way to the top, so its smell should be more fragrant. By leaving a little bit of space of air, it could air out and the smell would become more apparent. And then when you actually use the barrel to take the wine out, you would not bring leimi pia chavis, you wouldn't take directly from the top of the barrel, because of the flowery specks that rise to the top of the wine. You also wouldn't take it from the bottom because of the sediment that could collect there. Rather from the middle third, and of the middle third, the middle of the middle third. And the way you would do it, as becomes apparent from the next halacha, is that you would actually make the spout, or the hole, in the middle of the barrel. So it would draw out first the wine in the middle of the barrel. Haya hagizbar yoshev, says the Rambam Malacha Zayin, the treasurer who was in charge of getting the wine would sit there. And the wine would come out from the hole in the side of the barrel where he made the spout. And he would supervise it. Once he would observe a change as the sediment began to come out of the hole, he would stop, no longer take from the wine. At what point could a barrel of wine be used? From 40 days after it's been pressed till 2 years, or a little more. If you brought aged wine, vintage wine, many years old, kosher, that's kosher, so long as its taste is not destroyed. People think today, as a blanket statement, aged wine is good. Not all aged wine is good. Some aged wine loses its taste. So, same thing over there in the Beis HaMikdash, had to be the best and not have lost its taste. That's the wine. Now we move on to the oil. Halacha ches, tisha minin bashemen. There are 9 categories of oil. Mipnei shinoi maisav, because of the difference in how you could process it. So I put up the chart here just so we'll be able to see the 9 stages that the Rambam is referring to. And it's really 3 series of 3. It all depends on how they were originally picked and harvested, and then it follows the same 3 steps 3 times. Ketzad, what does this look like? What are the 9 details? The first category is Zayis Shegirgirai Bereish HaZayis. It's an olive tree which you pick the olives off the top of the tree. They're the best because they're the most exposed to the sunlight. They grow the best, they have the best taste. Best oil, also production. Ubeirai Achas Achas. You pick them one at a time. Biksashai V'Nesanai Lasal. And you immediately crush them, put the oil that collected into the basket. Hashemen Sheyatza Mimenu Hu Harisha. And the oil that emerges from this crushing is first class, top tier. If you took these same olives, after getting the first series of oil from them, you took whatever remained of the olives and you pressed them again in a proper press, that's second class now. Because it came from the same original type of olives that were harvested from the top of the tree meticulously, but they were pressed with a press, not hand crushed, second level. If after you press them, you ground whatever remained of the olives and you repressed them, that's third class. Again, still on the higher level because it came from such olives that were harvested from the top of the tree. But since it's been pressed and pressed again, that's third class. Now, what if the harvesting was done in a different fashion? What if you had harvested all the olives mixed up together? You didn't pick from the top, from the bottom. And then you took them up to the roof to dry. And then afterwards, after this drying process was completed, you picked olive by olive, hand crushed them, put them in the basket. That's fourth class. First level of the second tier. They were not harvested from the top of the tree, from the middle of the tree. That's number 4. And then the same 2 steps follow. If you repressed it under the press after the hand crushing, what comes next is 5th class. If after the first pressing you grind the olives and then repress them, that's number 6. And then the final tier is olives that were harvested in an even lower fashion. If you harvested olives, and first thing you didn't do any hand crushing. You put them in a press inside the home, till they began to decompose a little bit. You took them to the roof, to dry out. And only then did you do the initial hand crushing, put them in the basket. So you kind of did like a little bit of a waiting time before the initial hand crushing. That's 7th class. First of the 3rd tier, but it's number 7 in all. After the hand crushing, you crushed it again in a press. That's number 8. Reground, repressed a second time. That's number 9. Now, when you look at it in this chart, you see basically 3 rows of 3. But this doesn't reflect the level of classes in which they're used halachically. Halachically, it's as though you have to take this square and turn it into a diamond, in which number 1 is on top, 2 and 4 is second class, 3, 5, 7 is third, 6, 8 is 4, and 9 is 5th. As the Rambam says right now, even though all these olive oils are kosher for the flour offerings, the highest one that has nothing on top of it is number 1. Then you have number 2 and number 4 are both equal. Why? Because even though this is step 2, but it's from a superior type of harvesting. This is step 1 from an inferior type of harvesting. They're on the same level. Then you have 3, 5, and 7, and they're all equal. Then you have number 6 and 8, and they're both equal. And number 9, nothing less than it. That's the lowest grade. You only use it if you have to. Halacha Yud. All these 9 are only kosher for flour offerings. But there was something else the oil was used for in the temple, for the menorah. Ein kosher lemenorah ela rishayin u'revi u'shvi bilvat. Nothing of these 9 are kosher for the menorah except for the first of every tier. Number 1, number 4, and number 7. Shenemar, because by the menorah it says, kosis lamoyer, it has to be crushed for the luminary, for the lighting. Which means only when the olive oil is hand crushed is that kosher. Even though it's more inferior levels of harvesting, but the first step of all the tiers is a hand crushing. And therefore these are the ones that are kosher for the menorah. In kosher la menorah la yetzim in akosos bilvad. Kosis means the only thing kosher for the menorah is the one that comes from crushed olives, and therefore only 1, 4, and 7 are kosher. But again, for flour offerings, they're all kosher. Asks the Rambam, and with this he concludes the laws, which also an ethical perspective on this whole concept and really this whole chapter. If all the 9 categories of oil are kosher for the flour offerings, lama nimnu, why were they counted out? Why is it important to know all the 9? If they're all kosher anyways, just say all olive oil is kosher. Now, of course, and the Rabbi points this out as well, we just said why they had to be counted, because for the menorah, only 3 of them could be used. Only 1, 4, and 7 are kosher, not all of them. But the Rabbi says for that, you could just say 1, 4, and 7. You don't have to go through all 9. Why did you count them out specifically so that I know that there's 9 grades and how they're divided in all the tiers? Because it's important to know what's the best, nothing higher than it, what's the average, and what's the lowest, so that the person can pick. Because any person who wants to bring merit upon himself, will subdue his evil inclination, which would usually have him default to getting away with the lowest tier. He'll subdue it, and expand his hand, spend more, and bring his sacrifice from the nicest, most praiseworthy within the type that he wishes to bring. As it says in the Torah, the very first story of brotherly fighting, Cain and Hevel, Adam's 2 kids. So what does it say? It says Cain came up with the idea to bring a sacrifice. He came up with it first. He was the instigator. But then Hevel, his brother, it says, V'Hevel hevi gamhu. Hevel also brought, second, he followed his brother's lead, but he brought best quality. Hevel hevi gamhu mi b'chayreis tzayleyo mechelvein, from the firstborn of his sheep and from the fattiest ones. And therefore, Vayisha Hashem al Hevel ve'al minchasei, Hashem turned to Hevel and to his offering. Even though Cain came up with the idea, but Cain, in the type that he chose, brought the lower type. Whatever type you choose, you got to bring the highest type. And that's why it's important to know this. And from here, the Rambam learns to everywhere else in halacha. V'hu adin b'chol davar, shu l'shem ha'kel ha'toif. Same thing applies to anything which is being used in the service of Hashem, the good God. If it's for the good God, we should bring the good of our possessions and the nicest ones for Him. For example, in Bana-based tefillah, if you build a shul, a place to daven, so it should be built and constructed nicer than the own house in which you live in. If you feed a hungry person, feed him from the greatest and the sweetest on your table. If you clothe a naked person, cover him with the nicest of the clothing. Hikdish davar, if you consecrate something to Hashem, yakdish min hayafesh b'nechasav, you should also sanctify from the nicest of your possessions. V'cheinu emer, as it says also in the context of sacrifices, kol chelev laHashem, all fatty things belong to God, the goymer, etc. The Rebbe spent a lot of time on this halacha. He would quote it extensively, and the main question that he asked was, if this is a principle that applies across Jewish law, why do you say it here in the context of sacrifices? He should say it in the context of the laws of the shul, building a shul. Spend the most money, make it the best. Even in the laws of tzedakah, he could have said it. You want to give tzedakah, give the nicest. Plus, the Rambam seems to choose different examples. And the Talmud talks about hidur mitzvah, beautifying a mitzvah, and it talks about making a lulav or a sukkah, writing a nice Torah scroll, tzitzis. The Rambam goes for a whole different set of examples. And the Rebbe says, because the Rambam is communicating a much deeper idea. Typically, when a Jew does a mitzvah, even though we use objects in fulfillment of the mitzvah, but in the end of the day, the ultimate goal is our fulfillment of the mitzvah. Yes, we use physical objects, but it's so that we can do mitzvahs. And then, because we are doing a mitzvah, the holiness then devolves also upon the object, and the object becomes holy. Tefillin becomes holy, tzitzis becomes holy, etc. But there's one mitzvah, and only one mitzvah, where the mitzvah begins with the object, not with the person. That's sacrifices. The whole idea of a karban is taking something which belongs to us, an object, and bringing it to Hashem. And from that perspective, Torah is communicating to us that not just when you're doing a mitzvah for yourself should you seek to be the nicest, but when you're starting with the object, that should be the nicest. It's actually hinted in the verse that the Rambam brings. But Hevel doesn't say Hashem just turned to Hevel. Hashem turned to Hevel and to his mincha, because there was two elements. There was him, and there was the object that he was using, the mincha itself. And that's something that's unique to sacrifices, which is why the Rambam, when talking about sacrifices, brings out this law and changes from the examples in the Talmud. Because those are talking about a person beautifying his mitzvah. You're using tefillin, you're using tzitzis, make them nice. Here, we're talking about things themselves. The shul that you build, the tzedakah that you give, the clothing that you give. The Rabbi says the Rambam never, in a revealed way, mentions Kabbalistic concepts, but if you look carefully, you'll see them hinted. In Kabbalah, we talk about the three levels that serve a person: mazon, levush, and bayit. Food goes inside you, clothing protects you from the outside, but in a fitted way, and then the home, shelter, protects you in a more enlarged or surrounding, encompassing way. The Rambam chooses these three examples: feeding a hungry person, clothing, and then a house of tefillah. Those essential objects become inherently holy, and the inherent holiness in the object should be sought out to beautify Hashem. As the Rambam concludes, kol chelev, all fatty things belong to Hashem. If you look in this verse, the words kol chelev la Hashem are the end of a verse. Yet the Rambam adds the word v'goimer, which is usually used when it's a quote from the middle of a verse, which means like etc. What's the etc.? Etc. that Rabbi once said means every Jew has to apply this to himself. I'm giving you the main core principles. Whatever you do, do for Hashem, etc. Now apply it to your own life. Everything in your own life, find the way that you could beautify it and give Hashem the choicest, best parts of them. Brich Rachamana Desayan, blessed is Hashem who grants us assistance. Mazel Tov for concluding the laws of Issurei Mizbeach, the entities that are forbidden to the altar.